Too assertive, not collaborative enough. Doesn't really align with the company's evolving culture. That's how the conversation began behind closed doors, 3 weeks before the termination. A group of senior executives, most of them new, none of them diverse, sitting around a polished oak table in a high-rise boardroom, dissecting the performance of the company's most loyal executive without her presence, without her input. The verdict had already been reached before the first word was spoken. And when the decision finally reached her, it came wrapped in vanilla-scented pleasantries and corporate jargon. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. The morning began like any other. Brianna James stepped into the gleaming marble lobby of Archer and Lex, her heels clicking rhythmically across the floor. 10 years of unwavering loyalty. 10 years of performance reviews rated exceptional. 10 years of solving other people's messes with quiet efficiency. And today, the glass elevator did not respond to her keycard. She tried again. Nothing. Behind the reception desk, a security guard she didn't recognize looked up and said nothing at first, just smirked. "Miss James," he finally said, gesturing toward the secondary hallway. "You've been asked to check in with HR. Please come with me." The echo of that beep, the one that denied her access, stayed with her long after the elevator doors slid closed, as did the smirk. She followed in silence, the sterile brightness of the hallway washing over her like cold water. It was the kind of corridor where careers ended, where the company stripped you of your identity and walked you out before the news could make it to your team's Slack channel. In the HR conference room, the tension arrived before the HR manager even opened her mouth. Janet was her name. She didn't meet Brianna's eyes when she spoke, didn't offer coffee or condolences. Just slid a thick envelope across the table like it was a business card and muttered something about realignment and new leadership direction. The severance was generous. That was their insurance policy. Payment for silence. But something about the way it all unfolded didn't make sense. The timing, the absence of prior warning, the sudden disappearance of meetings from her calendar the week before. Her department had just exceeded quarterly targets by 17%. Her budget reductions had saved the firm millions. She'd been mentoring rising talent, onboarding new leadership, smoothing over executive friction caused by a CEO who didn't understand the company he inherited. None of it mattered now. Brianna James, 38, Senior Director of Strategic Solutions, was being erased like she'd never existed. She left the building with her dignity folded neatly inside a cardboard box. The walk from the 42nd floor to the sidewalk was a gauntlet of half-glances and awkward silence. Coworkers who once smiled now looked away. The woman from finance ducked into a conference room. Her former assistant muttered something inaudible and vanished into the elevator without waiting. Brianna had seen this before. She just never thought it would be her. She made it to her car, a sleek black sedan, bought after her last promotion, and sat in silence. The steering wheel cold beneath her fingers. Her phone buzzed with unread messages. "Wait, what happened? Are you okay? I just heard. This can't be real." A decade of building something that felt permanent wiped away in under 15 minutes. She drove home on autopilot, the city blurring past. Her penthouse apartment overlooked the skyline. It had once been her reward for years of sacrifice. Now it felt like someone else's prize. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened her personal laptop, the one she'd always kept separate from her work devices, and began pulling together her files. Brianna wasn't careless. She was deliberate. She'd archived every review, every memo, every performance evaluation for a reason. It was just how she operated. Disciplined, methodical, relentlessly organized. The documents painted a story. Glowing feedback, above-average metrics, records of speaking engagements and diversity workshops she'd led without additional compensation. There was even an internal audit that used one of her process frameworks, published with someone else's name on the front. She stared at the severance package sitting on her counter. It demanded silence. It offered security. 18 months of pay, if she agreed to disappear quietly. But as she scrolled through her emails, another kind of story began to take shape. Emails where her ideas had been reframed by others. Threads where she was excluded from final decisions despite leading the groundwork. The CEO's comments about fit, about tone, about how some voices dominate the room. Always coded, always deniable. She remembered the feeling in those meetings. The subtle but unmistakable shift after Brett Hawkins arrived. The new CEO with the Harvard MBA and an army of yes-men. He'd praised her insights publicly while sidelining her privately. Her name stopped appearing on meeting invites. Her team was restructured. A new hire, young, white, male, was brought in to help you scale the department. She'd known something was wrong, but she'd been loyal. And now the mask had slipped. Brianna's inbox held more than data. It held receipts, patterns, a roadmap of how a high-performing black woman could be reduced to a footnote when she became too competent, too confident, too visible. The sun dipped below the city skyline. Brianna closed her laptop. She walked to her window and looked out at the towers of steel and glass. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Brett Hawkins was probably having a drink, celebrating another bold decision that no one would question until it was too late. She whispered to herself, just loud enough to feel it in her chest. They thought they were ending something, but all they had done was press start. Brianna James had always believed that the numbers didn't lie. In fact, she had built her entire career on that belief. Reading patterns, spotting gaps, finding efficiencies that no one else could. For 10 years at Archer and Lex, she had been the company's internal compass. Not flashy, not loud, just consistently correct. The kind of leader who solved problems before they became headlines. Now, she sat at her dining table, surrounded by the eerie quiet of her high-rise apartment, staring at the severance package again. 18 months of salary, full benefits, equity vesting, all hers if she signed away her voice. Something wasn't right. Generous severance was rarely generosity. It was insurance, especially when offered without a fight, especially to someone with spotless performance reviews and metrics that outshone most of the executive team. It was too much money for too little reason. A payout disguised as a muzzle. Brianna wasn't naive. She had worked in this world long enough to recognize a cleanup operation when she saw one. She knew how reputations were managed and how stories were reshaped behind closed doors. She just never expected to become the next story erased. The first sign came quietly, a view alert on her LinkedIn profile. Then another, and another. Anonymous viewers from consulting firms, investment groups, and media outlets. Word was spreading. Then came the silence. Her usual network, the connections that once flooded her inbox with opportunities and praise, grew suddenly quiet. Emails went unanswered. Scheduled calls were postponed. Her name, once echoed in decision-making rooms, was now met with polite deflection. The second sign arrived with her morning coffee. A text from a former colleague. Short, hesitant, cryptic. They're saying things about you. Just wanted you to know. Brianna didn't need details to know what things meant. It was always the same playbook. Quiet whispers about being difficult or not aligned. Feedback recast as rebellion. Advocacy twisted into defiance. She opened her laptop. Her instincts kicked in before fear could take hold. For a decade, she had meticulously archived everything. Her notes, meeting decks, email threads. Every performance review, every product launch timeline, every departmental report she'd signed off on. It was a habit born of discipline, not paranoia. But now it felt prophetic. She pulled up a spreadsheet and started cataloging timelines. It began to take shape slowly, like a shadow moving behind glass. After Brett Hawkins became CEO, the structure had started shifting. Brianna had noticed it then. Project responsibilities reassigned quietly, budget approvals delayed without explanation, meetings she used to lead now being hosted by junior managers. She remembered the moment her calendar began to empty. It hadn't felt like sabotage at first, more like gradual erosion, a shift in tone. The way Brett smiled when he said, "We just need fresh energy." The way her suggestions were taken under advisement, but never implemented. The way her team was splintered and repositioned under people she'd once mentored. The memory of her final performance review stung more now. The words had been warm, almost glowing. High-impact leadership. Exceptional communicator. Valuable asset to strategic alignment. That was less than 4 months ago. Why, then, had her termination required no warning, no justification, no explanation? She poured another cup of coffee, her fourth that day, and began comparing exit timelines. In the past 18 months, 10 senior leaders had left Archer and Lex. 7 were women. 5 were people of color. Of the 5 women of color who had occupied executive leadership roles, 4 were now gone. Brianna had been the last. Pattern emerged. One that wasn't just coincidental but statistical, measurable, indicting. In between filtering columns and recalculating pivot tables, Brianna's memory drifted back to the leadership summit 2 quarters ago. Brett had spoken then about culture recalibration and streamlining executive alignment. His words were vague but dressed in confidence. She remembered how he had gestured toward the future, one of agility and bold decisions. Now she saw the subtext with clarity. Recalibration had meant replacement. Streamlining had meant removal. At 2:17 p.m., her phone buzzed again. A new message from another former employee, someone she'd once mentored. The note was cautious, but the concern was real. They're saying your departure was related to behavioral concerns. Just so you're aware, people are afraid to push back. Brianna didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. By nightfall, the line between suspicion and certainty had been erased. This wasn't restructuring. It was erasure. Carefully timed, deliberately executed, surgically silent. She walked to her balcony. The city lights blinked back indifferently. Somewhere down there, boardroom conversations continued as if nothing had happened. But in her mind, Brianna could hear them. The meetings where her future had been decided. The closed-door sessions where her 10 years had been condensed to a bullet point. Clean exit. A generous package. No press. No noise. Except now there was noise. Her mind began to churn. Not with grief, but with momentum. Every email she pulled up added another pixel to the picture. Memos where she was excluded. Meetings where her name was missing. Strategy decks revised after submission. Her credits removed. She opened a folder titled Equity Strategy, Q4. Inside were slides she had presented just weeks before, an efficiency roadmap that projected savings in the millions. The same plan Brett had dismissed as misaligned. The same plan, she now realized, had been passed off as someone else's last Friday. She leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. Not with fear, but clarity. They hadn't fired her because she failed. They fired her because she succeeded. Too visibly, too confidently, too boldly for a leadership team that wanted optics without substance, progress without challenge, and diversity without voice. Brianna didn't sleep that night. She didn't cry either. She worked. She built a timeline. She documented the discrepancies. She coded the patterns. By sunrise, she had transformed her career obituary into a case study. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The severance agreement still sat on her counter, untouched. It might have been money to some, but to her it was a receipt. Proof that they thought she could be bought. They were wrong. Because the story of her departure had already begun writing itself. And soon it wouldn't be one she authored alone. By the time Brianna James clicked send, it wasn't just a data report. It was a reckoning. Her email wasn't fiery. It didn't point fingers. It wasn't even long. But it was deliberate, composed, calculated. A measured release of truth dressed in data. 23 pages of documentation, charts, and figures, attached to a single paragraph that began, "After 10 years of dedicated service, I am no longer with Archer and Lex. Below, I've compiled the pattern behind that decision, so it's not repeated in silence. No anger. No accusations, just truth." She didn't expect a reaction right away. She assumed the email would circulate internally, maybe trigger a few conversations, perhaps even get buried beneath a pile of HR memos. But less than 10 minutes later, her phone began buzzing. Not with outrage at first, but confusion. Messages from junior associates she hadn't spoken to in months. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." Then, within the hour, the confusion turned to fear. Fear in the eyes of employees who had seen something similar, but hadn't yet had the language or the proof to describe it. And once that fear had a framework, the silence cracked. The spreadsheet she had shared, outlining terminations, severance disparities, and demographic attrition, circulated like contraband within the company. Slacks buzzed quietly, inboxes forwarded silently. Former employees received it through encrypted emails and private DMs. By lunchtime, her inbox was overflowing with anonymous notes from current employees. One described being quietly demoted after requesting parental leave. Another mentioned an informal request to stop mentoring ERG, Employee Resource Group, events because it wasn't considered billable impact. None of them had spoken publicly before. Now they were writing to her, and something about that made Brianna pause. She had started this fight assuming she was alone. But in the span of a few hours, her isolation had become a movement. People began comparing stories, digging through their own archives. Former interns remembered how her name had been scrubbed from strategy presentations. A colleague in the European division messaged her saying he recalled seeing one of her proposals presented in a global meeting under someone else's name, after she'd already left the project. The pattern stretched far beyond her. At 2:03 p.m., a quiet message landed in her inbox from a marketing manager she barely knew. It was just one sentence. "I've seen them do this before." And that's when Brianna realized what had started. It wasn't just vindication. It was validation. Her story had become a mirror, and people were seeing themselves reflected in it. The Whisper network bloomed like wildfire. Her email, originally addressed to Archer and Lex leadership, board members, and select professional peers, was now circulating on Slack channels at other firms. Law firms, consultancies, hedge funds. One forward turned into 3. 3 became 300. The document had gone corporate viral, and no amount of PR scrub could erase it. LinkedIn messages turned into reposts. Reposts turned into commentary. Within 24 hours, her name trended in industry circles, quietly at first, then publicly. She hadn't even spoken to the press yet. But the public was already listening. Colleagues from other firms began reaching out. Black women in tech, indigenous professionals in healthcare, Latinx managers in nonprofits, all reading between the lines of her report and seeing their own careers slowly erased in spreadsheets. Some had stayed quiet for years, convincing themselves that what they experienced wasn't real, or worse, not worth fighting. But Brianna had done the thing no one else had dared. She documented it. And not just as anecdotal injustice. She had shown the math. That was what terrified them the most. This wasn't a rant. It was a report. And numbers made it undeniable. By that evening, former clients were chiming in. One sent her a simple note. "You led our transformation project. You were the reason we stayed with Archer and Lex. I'm so sorry this happened." Another forwarded an internal memo, proof that her strategy model was still in use, just rebranded under a new leader. Brianna read that one twice. The truth wasn't just setting her free. It was shaking walls. What began as an act of self-defense was becoming a corporate earthquake. Inside Archer and Lex, executives scrambled to contain the damage. But the truth moved faster than spin. They underestimated how far loyalty stretched beyond the building. Brianna hadn't just built programs. She had built people. Dozens of careers had grown under her mentorship, her guidance, her example. And those people were now watching, quietly, respectfully, but with fire in their eyes. A junior analyst compiled her own version of the spreadsheet and began circulating it with updated numbers. A mid-level manager pulled records from HR, noting a suspicious pattern of performance review downgrades timed just before layoffs. One by one, employees who had nothing left to lose, or had already lost it, joined the conversation. And the crowd grew. By the time a prominent journalist tweeted a redacted screenshot of Brianna's report, "If true, this will change everything," The company had gone from controlled messaging to full damage control. Internal meetings were postponed. Board members requested emergency sessions. Legal teams started reviewing every severance agreement signed in the last 3 years. And through it all, Brianna remained quiet. She didn't post. She didn't engage in the firestorm. She didn't tweet hashtags or write medium essays. She didn't need to. Her words had already been written. Her numbers had already been crunched. She simply watched the echoes grow louder. Because now, she wasn't the only one with a voice. Her story had become their story. And the company that had once erased her name was now trying to outrun it. But the thing about numbers, they always find their way back. In the 2 days following her email, Brianna James barely left her apartment. Not because she was hiding, not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time in her 10-year career, she had nothing left to lose, and that gave her a kind of freedom she hadn't felt since her early 20s. The kind that burned slowly, not loud, not explosive, but steady, measured. She didn't waste time refreshing social media or searching her own name online. The flood of LinkedIn mentions, private messages, and whispers from journalists spoke loudly enough. Screenshots of her email had spread through corporate group chats like wildfire. People in industries she'd never touched, tech, media, law, were now quoting her lines in tweets and think pieces. But Brianna didn't care about virality. She cared about accuracy. She cared about outcomes. And now, her focus shifted from exposure to execution. In her home office, she sat before a wall of charts. Printed timelines lined the bookshelves. Her whiteboard mapped out names, project titles, budget shifts, and performance metrics like a detective tracking movements in a criminal conspiracy. She reviewed them with clinical precision, not as a woman seeking revenge, but as a professional conducting an autopsy. Because Archer and Lex hadn't just let her go. They had surgically removed her from their corporate DNA. What they hadn't expected was that she had copies of everything. Brianna began building what she called the package. Not a blog post, not a tell-all, but a polished, airtight, data-backed exposé that would do what her original email had only started: prove intent. The spreadsheet was no longer enough. She needed context. She needed testimony. So she went digging. She reconnected with peers who had vanished quietly after years of celebrated service. A Black senior engineer who had led their automation revamp. A Latina product strategist whose diversity report was shelved after being deemed too polarizing. A biracial UX lead who was realigned into a non-managerial role weeks after being nominated for a leadership award. They all had stories. None of them had platforms. Until now, Brianna offered no promises. She wasn't leading a class action lawsuit. She wasn't building a nonprofit. She just wanted the truth to breathe. And when people realized she wasn't in this for clicks or headlines, they trusted her. What she discovered over the next 48 hours went deeper than she imagined. Patterns emerged, sharper this time. There had been efforts to reposition performance ratings post-review. Vague language that downgraded impact or questioned executive presence. HR notations that didn't appear on official performance documents but circulated internally as informal warnings. Most damning of all, she found notes from a diversity leadership workshop, one she had helped design, where senior executives referred to it as cosmetic culture work. Cosmetic. That was the word they used for her life's work. The week before she was terminated, Archer and Lex had signed off on a recruitment campaign promising to build leadership that reflects the world we serve. But behind the scenes, they'd replaced her with someone who matched their reflection instead. Still, Brianna remained measured. No press statements. No interviews. Instead, she worked quietly with a team of pro bono advisors, friends from business school, former interns now in legal professions, data scientists she once mentored. They helped her refine the package into something surgical. She wrote an executive summary that read like an investor briefing. Each page paired an anecdote with a metric. Each claim was followed by a source. There were no accusations without substantiation. No hyperbole, just evidence. By the time the document was complete, it read like a corporate autopsy report, anatomy of a bias-driven leadership culture. She had planned to release it anonymously. But then, something unexpected happened. An email landed in her inbox from a managing director at a global consulting firm. Someone she'd never met in person. A simple message, just 5 lines long. But the weight of it left her breathless. "We've been watching. We believe you. Let us know if you ever want to build something new." Brianna stared at the screen for several minutes. Not because she needed a job, but because it was the first time in days she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt momentum. The power was shifting, and she was at the center of it. Within hours, other messages followed. Journalists, policy groups, VC firms, all interested in her findings. Some offering platforms, others offering capital. A few simply offered thanks. But still, Brianna waited, because the package was ready. But the timing needed to be perfect. And then it arrived. An anonymous employee at Archer and Lex forwarded a screenshot. An internal email from the new chief operating officer. The subject line read, "Communications Protocol for Media Inquiries Regarding Former Employees." Inside, the message outlined a strategy to downplay allegations by reframing performance concerns and emphasizing restructuring priorities. They weren't investigating her claims. They were strategizing their counterattack. That was the moment she knew. Silence was no longer an option. The next morning, Brianna scheduled a call with 3 reporters she trusted. 2 were women of color. One had built her career uncovering corporate cover-ups. She didn't give them everything. She gave them enough. Enough to light the match. By midday, the first article dropped. Whistleblower data exposes patterns of discrimination at major consulting firm. It didn't name Archer and Lex directly, but it didn't have to. The redacted charts, the interview excerpts, the anonymized quotes. It was clear who the report was about, especially to those inside the walls. By nightfall, 2 more publications had picked up the story. An influencer in the HR space reposted the executive summary. Then came the podcasts. Then the video explainers. And within 24 hours, the firm's silence was no longer control. It was surrender. Because they didn't just have a problem with a former employee. They had a problem with every employee who now saw the cracks. The power had shifted. And Brianna James wasn't waiting for justice anymore. She was writing it. The world had noticed. What began as a spreadsheet, quietly attached to a resignation email, had now detonated into something else entirely, a movement disguised as a document. The report that Brianna James had assembled in her high-rise apartment, fueled by 3 sleepless nights and a decade of restraint, had escaped the corridors of Archer and Lex. It was no longer hers to protect or explain. It belonged to inboxes now and forwarded emails, and social feeds with comment sections filled with employees whispering, "That happened to me." And then someone removed the redactions. Not carelessly, but intentionally. The anonymized charts in the original exposé had kept names out of headlines. But the media's curiosity had swelled too fast to stay contained. A leak from inside the firm had unblurred the data, and with it came identities, positions, and proof. Names long erased from internal wikis were suddenly front and center on news tickers. Her name, Brianna James, former Senior Director of Strategic Solutions. 10-year veteran, MIT-trained data architect. The woman whose story had been dismissed as personal grievance was now being profiled by the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and The Atlantic, all within 24 hours. Her inbox swelled to 5 digits. Recruiters, journalists, fellow whistleblowers, board members, regulators. The world had seen her name before, quietly listed beneath strategy decks and white papers, but now they saw her face. They read her words. They heard the calm fury in every sentence of her report. And, perhaps for the first time, they listened. She had not screamed. She had not named names in her email. She hadn't demanded apologies. But what she had done was harder. She had presented the truth plainly, without dramatics, without venom. And that made it harder to argue with, harder to dismiss. It was no longer, he said, she said. It was, this is what the data shows. And the data did not blink. Across industry Slack channels, employees swapped stories with the heading, "Do we have a Brianna James here?" Her story became the framework others used to recognize their own patterns. Legal teams reread past NDAs. Executive assistants began cataloging who was pushed out and who replaced them. HR professionals suddenly faced a question they weren't used to answering. How would this look on a timeline? Inside Archer and Lex, the atmosphere shifted from smug silence to panic disguised as damage control. Their carefully crafted narrative, that Brianna had been let go due to cultural realignment, began to unravel. Not because someone fought back, but because someone pulled back the curtain. Brianna's report showed a series of performance reviews where her ratings had gone from exceptional to meets expectations within months of her challenging a leadership change. It showed the correlation between promotions and social proximity to the CEO's inner circle. It showed how, after she raised questions about compensation equity, her bonus eligibility was reevaluated. And perhaps most damning of all, it showed the replacement. Same title, same responsibilities, no advanced degree, lower pay grade, but somehow a better cultural fit. People couldn't unsee it once they saw it. The internal Slack channel at Archer and Lex, the one created for women in leadership, was flooded with private messages. Those who had stayed silent for years finally began speaking. Some described being praised in public and undermined in private. Others shared their resignation letters, drafted but never sent, tucked away like escape plans. A few had already signed the NDA packages and could only watch. But they watched, and they forwarded. Brianna remained silent online. She didn't tweet, didn't post celebratory selfies or "I told you so" captions. She remained, as she had always been, composed, grounded, focused. But inside her apartment, she felt everything. The exhaustion, the fear, the surreal clarity of what it meant to become a symbol when all she had wanted was accountability. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted the truth to matter. On a Thursday morning, the dam broke. A high-ranking board member at Archer and Lex resigned suddenly. No announcement, just a quiet profile update that read "former." An hour later, 3 more stepped down. Then the COO. Then the head of HR. The company released a statement. It was everything she expected: measured remorse, promises of investigation, commitment to reviewing policies. But the phrasing didn't matter anymore, because the world had moved past statements. The Department of Labor had opened a formal inquiry. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had requested documentation. The firm's largest client paused their contract, citing brand concerns. But none of this brought Brianna peace, because while systems shook, she still hadn't grieved what she lost. The career she'd built, the quiet pride she carried, the community she had led. She hadn't sat with it long enough to feel its full weight. She made herself tea and looked out at the skyline, wondering how many others sat behind glass walls with stories like hers, but no words to tell them. Then came the call. A firm she had once admired, led by a woman she had mentored years ago, offered her a seat at the table, not to return to corporate life, but to help rebuild it. They didn't want her to fill a role. They wanted her to design a system, to create a framework that could be adopted across companies, embedding equity in the process rather than painting it on the surface. They wanted her blueprint, her data, her discipline, her fire. And for the first time in weeks, Brianna let herself feel something more than fatigue. Hope, not for herself, but for the people who would never have to go through what she did because someone had left the door cracked open. She didn't accept right away. She didn't need to, because the power wasn't in being offered a seat anymore. The power was in knowing she could build her own table, draw her own blueprint, and never again ask for permission to be heard. The truth was out, and now it was echoing in rooms where silence once reigned. The tremors didn't come all at once. Like all collapses, the system gave way slowly at first, as though still believing it could hold itself upright by sheer habit. But by the time Archer and Lex's executive wing realized what had been unleashed, the structure had already cracked at its foundation. The first consequence came quietly, camouflaged as coincidence. A Fortune 100 client placed a scheduled contract renewal under review. No press release, no outrage, just a single sentence buried in a procurement memo. pending further clarity around recent leadership concerns. The second was louder. A journalist published a follow-up, this time quoting several former employees who corroborated Brianna's analysis. Each voice was like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Collectively, they formed a picture no one could ignore, one of cultivated silence, curated performance narratives, and intentional erasure masquerading as strategy. What the firm had long presented as culture fit now rang with the coded echoes of exclusion. And outside its glass offices, the world was watching. Inside the company, the air changed. Meetings were hushed. Conversations that once flowed with casual arrogance now stumbled over caution. The same managers who had once touted leadership's vision now distanced themselves from it. Some removed company titles from their LinkedIn profiles. Others quietly booked consultations with PR advisors. A few simply stopped showing up altogether. It was not a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic leaks, no courtroom testimony, no viral confrontation caught on camera. It was something subtler, more insidious. It was data speaking louder than any voice ever had. And the company had no language to counter it. They tried. Internal emails promised listening sessions, culture recalibration workshops, and leadership town halls. But those words, once effective at calming discontent, now felt like echoes from a distant past. Because trust, once broken in silence, is not mended by sound. By the end of the week, 3 board members had stepped down. No statements, no explanations, just disappearances, as though hoping that absence might offer immunity. But absence, Brianna knew, was not an apology. She had watched from the sidelines, not with satisfaction, but with quiet clarity. She hadn't orchestrated the unraveling. She had simply told the truth, and let it do what it always did when left uncontained. She still hadn't responded to most interview requests. She hadn't written an op-ed or filmed a viral video. Her voice remained measured, selective, intentional. But she had accepted one invitation, to speak privately at a leadership conference for women of color in finance. The room was filled with professionals who understood the currency of silence. They knew what it cost to speak, and they knew what it cost to stay quiet. Many had done both. When Brianna stood at the podium that day, she didn't read from prepared remarks. She didn't frame herself as a hero or a cautionary tale. She simply described what had happened, not to her, but around her. She described what it felt like to be excellent in a space that didn't expect you to be steady in meetings designed to destabilize you, to be grateful for scraps while building systems others would later inherit. And as she spoke, she realized that this, more than any spreadsheet, was her legacy. Not the exposure of one company's failure, but the expansion of collective awareness. The reminder that systems don't fall because one person pushes, they fall because others stop pretending not to see the cracks. Meanwhile, Archer and Lex's leadership attempted damage control. The firm appointed a temporary chief equity officer. They issued a statement promising a third-party review of employment practices. They quietly offered settlements to several former employees, most of whom declined. Because the damage wasn't financial. It was foundational. Brianna's report had become a template. HR professionals at other companies began using her model to audit their own organizations. Business schools integrated it into ethics modules. DEI consultants cited her findings in boardroom strategy sessions. Even regulators took notice. The EOC launched a formal inquiry. The Department of Labor followed with its own request for internal performance data, diversity metrics, and compensation records. Suddenly, Archer and Lex wasn't just losing talent. They were hemorrhaging legitimacy. The company's stock, privately traded but publicly tracked, began to dip. Talent pipelines slowed. Influential partners pulled back. And still, Brianna remained calm. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply moved forward. Her consulting firm, newly registered but already busy, was receiving requests from startups, nonprofits, and financial institutions alike. Not because they feared scandal, but because they feared irrelevance. The market had spoken. Talent would no longer be loyal to companies that quietly erased people like Brianna. because people like her didn't just add value. They were the value. Archer and Lex's CEO finally resigned 1 month later. He issued a statement that felt as hollow as the boardroom that had once praised him. He cited family time and reflection. But everyone knew the truth. He hadn't stepped down. He had been made obsolete. And what replaced him wasn't just a new executive. It was a new expectation. Brianna understood, then, that her firing hadn't ended her career. It had elevated her purpose. Because in the silence they created, she had found her loudest voice. And in the system they tried to bury her beneath, she had found the blueprint for tearing it down. Gracefully, methodically, and forever. By the time Archer and Lex released their official apology, the world had already moved on. Because what happened to Brianna James was no longer a single executive's dismissal. It had become a turning point. And the firm's carefully crafted statement, polished by legal counsel and filtered through corporate PR, landed with all the weight of a paper umbrella in a monsoon. The apology named no one. It acknowledged gaps in process, unintended oversight, and the importance of recommitting to our values. But people weren't asking for recommitment. They were asking for reconstruction. And outside that firm's gleaming glass facade, a new structure was already rising. One not built by Archer and Lex, but by the woman they had erased. Brianna didn't call what she was doing a movement. She avoided the headlines and the hashtags. But her phone never stopped ringing. Her inbox never emptied. And what started as a solo reckoning had quietly evolved into an ecosystem. After her story broke, something remarkable began to happen. Other executives, mostly women, mostly black, began to connect with one another. Not just to grieve what they had endured, but to build what they wished had existed for them. Brianna didn't intend to lead them. She simply became the center point where they found each other. A former CFO in tech. A DEI director from the healthcare sector. An engineer turned strategist. All of them had stories not just of being overlooked, but of being quietly dismantled by systems too fragile to handle their excellence. Together, they built something new. They called it Framework. Not a nonprofit, not a resistance group, but a consulting collective grounded in one belief: that equity must be designed, not declared. That data must be weaponized, not just measured. And that leadership should be earned through integrity, not legacy. Within 3 months, Framework had secured contracts with 6 Fortune 500 companies. Not because those companies feared becoming the next scandal, but because they were afraid of becoming irrelevant. The ground had shifted, and talent was no longer loyal to logos. They were loyal to values. Culture was no longer measured by ping-pong tables and stock options, but by who thrived and who vanished. And they had all seen who vanished. Brianna's original report became a case study. It was taught in MBA programs, studied in HR certifications, referenced in DI circles around the world. Her methodology, pairing qualitative experience with quantifiable trends, became the gold standard for equity audits. But beyond metrics and media coverage, real changes were quietly taking root. At Archer and Lex, the boardroom no longer looked the same. Not just because people had stepped down, but because policies had stepped up. External oversight committees were established. Promotion metrics were made transparent. Performance reviews were redesigned to eliminate biased language. Exit interviews were no longer optional. But Brianna didn't return to the firm that had once discarded her. She didn't want revenge or redemption. What she wanted, what she always wanted, was for the system to stop eating its brightest. She remained exactly where she belonged, outside the building but inside the blueprint. Meanwhile, younger professionals watching from the sidelines saw something in Brianna that they hadn't seen before. Not just a woman who fought back, but a woman who redesigned the rules entirely. At a university business conference, her name was printed on placards, whispered in hallways, admired in quiet voices by students who looked like her, who had never imagined they'd survive corporate life, let alone transform it. When Brianna took the stage that day, no slides, no fanfare, just presence. She didn't speak about what was taken from her. She spoke about what she had reclaimed. Her voice, her integrity, her power. And in the silence between her words, the students heard something else, possibility. Because she hadn't just survived the system, she had reprogrammed it. Elsewhere, companies began implementing policies named in her honor, not as performative gestures but because those policies worked. The James Protocol, as some called it, involved mandatory performance audits, third-party oversight of executive terminations, and equity-centered leadership training. It was never meant to be revolutionary. It was simply meant to prevent the erasure of brilliance. The federal oversight that followed the Archer and Lex case sent ripples through the industry. A new bill, proposed and named after her report, passed in the Senate, requiring all publicly traded companies to publish anonymized employee attrition and promotion demographics. Brianna didn't ask for any of that. She rarely commented on it publicly, but those close to her knew the truth. She was still working, quietly, consistently, strategically. She spent most mornings mentoring rising leaders. She built scholarship funds. She reviewed audits for companies that truly wanted to change. She answered emails from women in cities she'd never visited, who said things like, "I was going to leave my job until I read your story. Now I'm staying, and I'm documenting." She had become the lighthouse, not the storm. She never asked for this role, but she carried it anyway, because the truth wasn't just something to tell. It was something to build with. Brianna never returned to a corner office, but she had something better. A reputation that no one could erase, a legacy that no firm could buy, and a community that didn't just follow her, they rose because of her. And somewhere, beneath the weight of what she'd built, she allowed herself, finally, to breathe. Not because the fight was over, but because it had only just begun, and she knew she wouldn't be fighting it alone. And that's where we leave Brianna James. Not broken, not bitter, but brilliant, deliberate, and rising. If her story moved you, hit that subscribe button to support more stories that matter. Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because real change begins with real conversations. And if you've ever been dismissed, doubted, or underestimated, remember, the truth doesn't just survive, it rebuilds.